Today, Open Source Security is talking to Alex and Cedric from CIRCL, which is the Luxembourg CERT, and you run the GCVE program. So I am ecstatic to have the two of you here. So I'll let you kind of introduce yourselves, and then we'll go from there, because this is, holy cow, do I have questions.
Yeah. So I'm Alex, and I'm the head and security researcher at CIRCL. CIRCL is the national CERT in Luxembourg, so we are dealing with incident response and so on. But next to that, we do a lot of other things, so including software engineering and many open source projects. So maybe some of you know MISP, which is a threat intelligence sharing platforms. But next to that, we do another software called Vulnerability-Lookup, which is doing vulnerability management, and it's a completely open source project. And to support that project, we started an initiative called GCVE, and I think that's why we are here today to discuss about this topic.
Indeed. And Cedric, I'll let you give yourself an intro.
So my name is Cédric, and I'm leading the developments on vulnerability lookup projects and various other tools and activities at CIRCL since a couple of years. So yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so yes, Alex is right. GCVE is the thing that definitely grabbed my attention, but the vulnerability lookup tool is very, very cool. And maybe I'll have you just come back and talk about that someday, because I like it. It's good. But GCVE, okay? So why don't you just tell us what GCVE is? Let's start there.
Yeah, so it's pretty straightforward and not that complex, but in computing, there is something very difficult. It's naming things and putting numbers on things. And that's exactly what GCVE is. It's actually giving a prefix numbers for authority that are assigning and creating vulnerabilities and distributing them. So GCVE project is basically that. Then behind the scene, there are much more indeed. But the first and key goal of GCVE is assigning numbers. So you have to see it as a kind of IANA for vulnerabilities authorities that are basically publishing vulnerability.
That is such an oversimplified answer. So, all right, Alex, I'm gonna hold your feet to the fire on this one a little bit, I think. So you mentioned assigning names to vulnerabilities. And I think the most, I guess, understood parallel here is like the CVE program in the United States. So the first question anyone's probably going to have is like, what GCVE and like CVE, are they different? How are they different? Why are they different?
Okay. First of all, we are not competing with any programs. Why we came with GCVE, the reason behind was the fact that we have seen that a lot of IDs are assigned for vulnerability. And Cédric might talk about it, but in vulnerability lookup, we basically ingest around 25 sources or even more nowadays from CSAF sources and so on. And plenty of sources have their own ID. GitHub security advisories,
PySec.
PySec, CVE programs, they have all their own IDs and so on. And that's totally fine. But the thing that we discovered when we were writing the software, we wanted to have an ability for others that basically cannot easily assign ID to publish their own vulnerabilities. And that's where the idea from GCVE came. GCVE is actually just giving prefix ID to authority to allow them to publish their vulnerabilities. That's basically it. The thing is, we don't compete with the other program because it's usually the GCVE IDs and the prefix as a prefix for all the existing programs. So that means GitHub security advisories, CVE programs have a prefix. So for example, GCVE-O is actually the CVE ID behind. So it's basically just compatible and backward compatible with existing programs. But we wanted to create a system that for the one that cannot be covered by existing program could assign on their own IDs. That's basically the system behind.
Okay, so Cedric, I'm gonna pick on you for a minute here, because so you're ingesting all this data.
Yes.
And we'll go off on a tangent for a moment, because you know the pain of vulnerability data and how atrociously bad it is.
So as Alex said, we are ingesting a lot of data with vulnerability lookup. We have near like 25 sources, and it's a total of 1 million vulnerabilities with different sources and as well different technology to get the sources. So we are using Git or HTTP APIs, and it's very, very, very diverse sources. So by nature, vulnerability lookup is already able to ingest that. And now with GCVE, the goal is to enable the distribution of vulnerabilities. So if you install your own vulnerability lookup, for example, as a company and you are a GNA, with our instance, it's possible to get the advisories that we publish, to subscribe to the feed. So any feed,
Okay.
if you are GNA, we can ingest it in vulnerability lookup by using the default API that we have designed.
Nice. So you just said the word GNA. What is a GNA?
It's a numbering authority.
Yeah, so it's basically a numbering authority. So for example, Josh, you could be a GNA. So if you are writing software, you are a security researcher, you are part of the existing CNA programs, or you are a CIRCL, you can become a GNA. So that means you can basically, on your own, decide to publish vulnerability. And that's exactly that we want to cover. What we have seen is a lot of organizations publish vulnerabilities or have difficulties to publish those vulnerabilities. And what Cédric was mentioning, in vulnerability lookup, we not only do lookup, the name is basically just lookup, but is additionally to that, we are able to publish data. So that means if you run your own instance, Josh, being a GNA, can start to publish their own vulnerabilities, and which is, I think, quite nice because it's becoming and giving some, I would say, freedom for security researcher, open source developers, and so on. The only conditions to basically get a GNA ID is to have a vulnerability disclosure policy or to be an existing CNA. So it's basically or logical. So that means basically if you have a vulnerability disclosure process and you publish vulnerabilities, then you can become GNA. So it's really, really straightforward. And the software that we built that is ingesting vulnerabilities from different sources is able to ingest data from other GNA to basically combine this with all the vulnerabilities that we have. And you mentioned something very important is the format. A lot of vulnerability sources have, I would say, kind of broken format. So we try to support that. In the GCVE program, we even give some best practices, which format to use. But we expect that some sources might be, even if they provide in a specific format, for example, if you look at the CSAF format, which is standardized to OASIS, which is pretty good, but sometimes some of the advisory doesn't pass the classic, I would say, the compliance level to just be parsable. So that's one of the common problems. So we don't want to solve the format problems. There are already enough formats. So the idea behind the GNA and the publication systems is to just get the data from an HTTP endpoint, and that endpoint is using the CV format. But if in the future someone wants to use a VEX format, what metadata, things like that, they can do it. So we just take care about the transport format.
Okay. So there's a lot to unwind, I think, in this answer, because we'll not go into data format complaining today.
Exactly.
We'll save that for another day. But yes, I know we could probably rant for hours and hours about the terrible data formats. But so I hear all this. You're talking about aggregating data. You're talking about people publishing their own data. This feels like the dream CVE has been talking about for decades, but you have done in a relatively short amount of time. And you don't have to agree with me, but that's what it feels like when you say this.
Yeah, so I think I'm quite involved into vulnerability disclosures. As a CERT, we basically do assignment of CVE ID on a regular basis and so on. Even as software engineers, we publish vulnerabilities for MISP. If you look at MISP, you have plenty of CVE. And I think that's part of the game. When you do software engineering, you end up with vulnerabilities. That's part of the game. The thing is, what we have seen over the time is there's different models for the CVE program, and I think that's what they want, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Is to have I would say, hierarchical publication system. So that means they actually want to control what the CNA are publishing to ensure the quality of the vulnerabilities disclosures. And I think I'm totally fine, and I'm a big supporter of that. As a CIRCL, I like to have good quality of vulnerability description and so on. And then you have discussion about, for example, conflict of vulnerability. So you might have two CNA publishing, and then you have to resolve conflict and so on. That's part of the CVE. program. That's why sometimes it's complex to publish things. I think from the GCVE one, I think I have my two heads there. I'm an open source developer, and for me, Git make a lot of sense. I mean, having two people maintaining two repositories, even from the same code base, doing forking, doing their own version, and so on, make a lot of sense. If at some point in time we agree, we merge from the Git repository, and that makes sense. I think for GCVE is exactly the same. We don't mind to have two GNA publishing about the same vulnerability. Now the question is, why it's a problem to have multiple publishing? I think it's not. So that's my point of view on this. The reason is the following. If I have a vendor publishing about the vulnerability disclosures, maybe they receive information from a security researcher. The vulnerability itself is super interesting. They fix the vulnerabilities, but they don't agree completely with the research from the security researcher. So they will publish their own advisory, which makes sense. They are the producer, they publish it. On the other hand, the security researcher might have a different point of view. And then you want to publish a security advisory too. And that's where I don't agree on the fact that it's an issue. I think it's an advantage. And I will explain why. As a CIRCL or a user of the software, I have the two point of view, and I can't take a decisions. I can't say, oh, from these software vendors, I got these vulnerabilities, but the security researcher told me, by the way, this vulnerability might lead to this and this impact that the vendors try to hide or do not agree. But that's totally fine there. But you, as a user consuming the information, and that you see where it's coming back with vulnerability-lookup, we want to see all the point of view. If you look at CVE ID right now, we have plenty different one. For example, for CSAF sources, you can see that, for example, the CSAF from Cisco might contain much more information than the actual CVE being published. And that's exactly what we basically not duplicate, but at least extend with GCVE in vulnerability-lookup is to add more metadata. Even our goal, we were discussing that maybe some will not publish vulnerability per se, but will publish meta information about vulnerabilities. Like, for example, Josh would say, hey, by the way, I applied this patch, it doesn't work. So the vulnerability is not fixed, the patch doesn't work, the vendor doesn't say it, but Josh, as a security researcher, is publishing the information under a GNA, and then the other can say, Josh is a good security researcher, maybe we should take into account his point of view. So that's really more the models of GCVE.
Holy cow. That's a very good explanation. I have never heard anyone explain some of the problems I think we see today in the CVE program with trying to like shovel one ID across the board for some of these problems than that. And you've uncovered many things I think I realized but never really thought about. And so I will explain part of the problem, and you can correct me as I go, because I'm sure I'll make mistakes. But we'll use log4shell as our example. Where log4shell comes out, there is one CVE ID that has literally thousands of references, and it affects every vendor differently. And it's just, it's utter chaos, right? Like if you look at that CVE, in fact, we have special code in our product for that CVE just because it's such a mess. Like you can't deal with it, right? And so you're saying instead of having one ID with 4,000 references, you have 4,000 IDs that each basically have one reference. And then there's obviously some sort of linking them all together, exactly. I assume.
You got it. It's exactly that. And Log4j is a very good example. So where it could happen, the software engineers that basically fix the vulnerabilities could describe a commit message where he did the fix and why he did the fix. Then you might have a security researcher. And if you remember for Log4j, we had like 2 or 3 CVE popping up because, the fix was not completely complete or correct. And then later on, other CVE pop up. So, for example, if a developer considers that this vulnerability is actually part of the same thing, they could say, okay, it's the same ID. On the other hand, maybe Red Hat is operating different kind of GVMs using the libraries. They might have different one. And then, as long as I think the services like vulnerability-lookup, which is an open source software, can gather all the information, then the one running Java application, so I have JBoss running, my JBoss using Log4j, yes, maybe. I'm running this on an operating system that might use Log4j for, I don't know, syslog, whatever things and so on. And then I have different layers. And then you see that you have different sources and it makes a lot of sense. I see, for example, I'm really interested to Vex because Vex is really doing metadata on CVE too. And you see it's exactly that with Red Hat. Red Hat, they publish Vex data sources with additional information about the software they package. And I think it makes sense. And still thinking that a single centralized organization will be able to handle all the use cases and so on, for me, it's an utopia. I know I had a discussion with people from CISA recently and so on, and say hi to Tom here. So I think we don't agree on that aspect, but that's totally fine. But I mean, it's complementary. You need to have meta information about vulnerabilities. It's changing, it's not fixed. The publication process is evolving. For me, we need to transition from TVS, SVN to Git. And that's what we are maybe in this transition for vulnerability, to have a distributed system for publication and so on. I have seen some initiative right now when they were afraid about the CVE programs having issues and so on, and they were like going into these blockchain models and so on. To be honest, I'm not a big fan of blockchain technologies and so on, so I don't think it's really a way to go. But for us, was really very simple. For example, Cédric, correct me if I'm wrong, but how long did you take for doing the implementation of the distributed publication?
It was quite very, very fast. So we, as I said, we already have all the fixes in the backend implemented. It's relying on the API of vulnerability-lookup. So it took like a couple of days. I mean, because we have as well the distribution of the registry. The registry is distributed. If you install a vulnerability-lookup instance, you don't only have the advisories from other sources, you have as well the central registry, which is cached in your vulnerability lookup instance.
Yeah,
so you don't have to make a request.
Yeah, true. And GCVE is just actually publishing a directory and with the entries of each GNA, and that's basically it.
And core functionalities like correlations of security advisories were already in vulnerability lookup since the beginning of the project is like that in the database. So we have correlations, and maybe we forgot to mention that we have bundles. If you have a lot of security advisories, we can create a bundle. It's a set of advisories with different sources as well and different kind of IDs.
Yes, so that means what we want is in the open source, and I think that's the thing that we want to see. It's other open source projects actually implementing the standard, which is very straightforward, and we have multiple implementations. People producing more data or more metadata. I'm sure that maybe some of your listeners are open source developer or users, and they could contribute some inputs there. That's, I think, what we want to capture.
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, so let me ask about that. And so, Cédric, you just talked about ingesting all this data. Do you have the ability to modify data inside of the tool, or is that as strictly you are only aggregating and mirroring?
No, we don't modify. We just get the data for the remote source. And if you want to edit, it automatically, we call it a fork. So it will be forked in your local source because it makes no sense to edit an advisory that you get from the CVE program. Anyway, it will be overwritten in the next round.
Which is, I think this question is super, super important. And I think it's totally thing that we need to talk about. The thing is, in vulnerability lookup instance, you can indeed fork data. And the thing, when you fork the data, you fork under your own ID. Mm-hmm. And the ID is basically the GNA ID. So if you want to extend an existing CVE or a CSAF, or even recently we introduced CNVD, so if you want to update a Chinese vulnerabilities that are discriminated in the national vulnerability database from the Chinese CERT, you can edit it and you can publish on your own. So it's becoming actually a fork of the data with additional information. So if you want quickly to fix that. And for me, I think the idea behind is to really push collaborations, because right now, what do you do to modify a CVE? So I'm an external person and I want to edit it. How can I do that? So you see, that's for me, applying the open source model to vulnerability make a lot of sense. But yes, I know maybe from the CVE program perspective, it's a different models. And I think it's complementary. Both will exist. And you need to have additional information, metadata for all the vulnerabilities.
I agree with everything you just said in ways you cannot imagine. I have tried updating CVE records and NVD records more times than I can count. And I would say more than 50% of the time, it has basically ended with me rage quitting because it is such a frustrating and horrible process versus you talking about like the open source model, GitHub has a vulnerability database that is a literal GitHub repository, and they accept pull requests to it. And I have never had an update to them take more than 24 hours to be accepted, or they'll tell me no and they'll explain why they disagree with me, and then I get sad because whatever. But the fact that I get a response is enormous progress.
Yeah,
so
but that's already great. I mean, and to be honest, hat off to GitHub, because the GitHub repository for vulnerabilities and so on is very good.
Yes.
So if users of, I would say, open source tools and so on from this audience today want to have a look, we have a running instance on the internet called vulnerability.circle.lu. Maybe you'll share the links later on. But I think if you want to see all the kind of relationship between CVE IDs, other IDs, and so on, because there's a lot of relationship. Indeed, CVE IDs are great to add the correlations. But if you look, for example, at the CNVD database, I think it was like, I don't know, 30% have no CVE ID. So that means, and that's something that we are even looking into more, it's to have more matrix table of all those ID together. So for example, we are working with the EVD database right now to basically have the mapping with the EVD in vulnerability-lookup. So that's straightforward. But it will be needed, and it's already needed for CSAF. If you look at all the CSAF sources, they have their own ID. I mean, Cisco has their own IDs, Siemens has their own ID, and that's totally fine. But you need to have like mapping IDs. But we have some idea on descriptions and so on. We in vulnerability-lookup, we have some stuff with AI called VLAI about severities, but we have some idea of basically creating correlations automatically through similarities of text. But that's outgoing work on the software.
Sure. Holy cow. This is really cool. And I want to also just kind of explain. So you mentioned if I want to modify the data, and in your universe, it creates what you call a fork, versus in the CVE universe. I mean, I can explain kind of what this looks like today, where there is inside of CVE records, they have the ADP, the authorized data provider, I think it's called.
Yes.
And the idea being, and this was the dream. There's the dream versus reality, where the dream was anyone could kind of be an ADP, and then like if Anchor, for example, the company I work for, wants to submit some different information because we have our own set of data. It's in GitHub and it's public, but like we have our own set of data where we modify certain CVE records when a customer contacts us and is like, hey, there's a mistake in this. We just fix it because, and if it's GitHub, for example, we'll go upstream to GitHub first. But if it's a CVE record, we've just given up. We're like, whatever, we'll just keep our own copy and we'll change it. But now we functionally have a fork of CVE, right? And we have no good way to explain this is a change we made. But in your universe, you've solved that problem where if someone makes a change, they just get a completely different ID and it has all of their different information. And I mean, heck, we had this, I worked at Red Hat for a decade. We had this problem all the time. I mean, the reason Red Hat publishes their own CVSS severity scores is because the NVD scores were so bad and the customers would contact us and we're like, we just have to do this, but now we have two databases, right?
Totally
You
true.
Aggregate them.
And there's one topic, but I think this one will be a complete topic by its own. It's CP. So the CP value, so the common platform enumerations. That's another thing that need to be in some way fixed. It's a tough one, but at least to have like product vendor IDs and so on in line. So in vulnerability-lookup, we try, for example, to map an organization to multiple organizations or vendor. The classical problem is acquisition of companies. So if you have Sun Microsystems that has been acquired up to Oracle, you still need to have the historical data. And if I want to search for the old GVM from Sun, right, it's still applicable. Another thing that we try to solve in vulnerability-lookup, but we still have, I think, a lot of work there. But I think the ID allocation problems, it's not, I would say, easy to solve, but that's something that we try to solve. What we did as an initiative for GCVE is not coming from nowhere. It's actually coming from all the past history. The thing is, for the CP part, which is an interesting topic about common platform enumerations, is this problem is not solved. But the same with organizations. So multiple organizations creating different vulnerabilities, they change names, they get acquired. There's duplication of names and stuff like that. it's another problem to solve too. So if you want to search, and you look at CPE, if you search for Microsoft has like 6 or 7 different entries as vendor.
At least,
yes.
Yeah, at least, yeah. So maybe even more. So that's something that is, I think, an inherent problem. And I think we have to tackle that diversity not by creating new standards, I think. We have to tackle that problem by creating open source software that will be able to basically process the data and start to combine it and produce data set and corpus that we can re-import afterwards. So that's really the model.
Okay, so I'll ask Cedric then. So do you support Perls? Because I had Philippe Ambredon on the show a couple episodes ago just to talk about Perl, which CPE versus Perl feels like, oh my goodness, like there's no comparison even.
Yes, but we plan to support it as well. So it's already in somehow in the platform. Yes, it's possible.
Okay, cool.
What we did actually is we have the notion of organization now. Organizations are containers for vendors. So we have a set of vendors linked to an organization. And for each organization, you can have products, and products can be linked to CPE or Perl.
Okay. That makes sense. That feels like the right thing to do.
And I think Perl might be one of the partial solution, I would say, for...
We just thought about it less.
Yeah, for CPE, for example. Yes. Yeah. So there's plenty of work. So, and what Philippe is doing there is great. I think it's really going in the right directions. But I think it's really focusing on packaging. And as a CIRCL, we have plenty of software that have basically no reference. Even the product name is super confusing. You have white labeling. Just look at classical things like a component for, I don't know, cars and things like that. Sometimes it's basically under a different label or different names, vendor names. And it's very difficult to track all of them because sometimes it's just a product name, which is linked to a specific manufacturer names. So it's the problem, I think, is just at the beginning of the issue that we have there.
Yes. What's the old joke? The two hardest problems in computer science are what? Cache invalidation and naming things and off by one errors, right? Yes. Like, I get it. It's it's always funny because, we have Anchor has Sift and Gripe, and Gripe, obviously Sift generates identifiers that Gripe then uses for doing lookups. And it always feels like we just go in these circles. We're like, oh, we should use Perls for everything. Oh, wait, but Perls don't do this thing. It's like, oh, crap. Well, how do we solve that then? Oh, let's do this thing. It's like, no, we're starting to invent a new way to do this. Like, stop doing that.
But there's something interesting about versioning and product name and vendor names. A lot of people say, yeah, but you need to verify these specific versions. And I say, don't look at versions. Look at already product and vendor names. It's already very difficult. Look at the current situation with SharePoint. One of my colleagues did a Nmap and SE script to scan for the proper versions. There is no easy way to do it. For example, he's doing it with GitLab, and he's looking at JavaScript files and versions to basically get and guess the versions. So even vendors are not able to provide the version number. So how can you security tools to find out the right vulnerabilities if even the source, the original software, is not able to give you the proper versions? And tough luck.
Yes. And sometimes you have versions that are linked directly to the name of the product or in the version field. So it's really...
Yeah, you have service pack on some Microsoft product within the product names and so on, which is like, why? But yeah.
Oh, it's funny because it's true. Okay, let's land this plane. So I feel like we've kind of had a random mishmash of topics, which is fine because this is a weird thing to do. So I would say we have a vague idea what GCVE is. And I've learned a whole bunch of new things that I didn't even realize before. But for anyone listening who's kind of interested in this, what would you recommend? Like, what are good ways to maybe get involved? I mean, this is all open source, which is amazing as well, which I love. But like, how can we use it? How can we contribute to it? How can we what are the next steps?
So there are multiple ways. So the first is just check out the website, gcve.eu, which include all the details about the process and so on. If you want to become GNA, you basically have a paragraph how to do it and send an email and you get GNA. It's super easy. No, if you want to go a bit further, like operating your own instance of vulnerability lookup for collecting vulnerabilities, and maybe in the future to publish it, you have to go to vulnerability-lookup.org, which is the website of the open source project. And if you are curious about how vulnerability lookup works and you want to see one live and you don't have time to install the open source versions, you just want to run and to use the services, we run one for free called vulnerability.circle. So circle like a circle with the E at the end, .lu. So vulnerability.circle.lu. And on this one, you can basically register and you can even use the platform, see all the vulnerabilities in different sources. API is completely accessible. We don't rate limit. We don't have anything to sell. We are a cert. So why we do that? We want that people use it to basically secure the infrastructure. So that's our goals. If they do it in Luxembourg, that's great. If they do it abroad, it's even better. So that's really the idea behind.
Amazing. And I have one last question then before we go. So there is also the European Union vulnerability database that's very new. What does that relationship look like between like GCVE and the EUVD?
We have a strong relationship. So the EUVD is part of the NIST directive, so it's the European Directive about Information Security. And the network behind, so it's a set of network of CIRCL. We are part of that network. And we even provide vulnerability lookup as a backend software for EUVD. So if you go on the EUVD website, you'll see that vulnerability lookup is actually one of the sources for them for the backend system. So EUVD, actually, it's ENISA is running it, and that's great. It's really basically to ensure that at European Union, we are able to basically have a CNA at European level. If one of the CCRs want to basically get a CVE IDs, they can just like go through the ENISA and so on. They are in the process to basically become a root level of CNA. So that makes a lot of sense. And in the future, so that's something that we're working with them. So we work closely with them. It's to ensure that the EUVD IDs are part of vulnerability lookup and distributed, and you have the correlation. So we are huge fan, and we work with them too. So if you run vulnerability lookup, you will be able to basically get the data from EUVD. That's pretty cool.
I love it. I love it. All right, Alex and Cedric, I want to thank you both. This has been an amazing conversation. I have learned so much more than I expected. So amazing, and thank you.
Thank you very much.